I want to do in this concluding lecture is obviously talk about a number of things that have received passing attention in this course, but now I think is a time to crystallize our thoughts on some of these matters. And what I'm interested in is a number of considerations. One, globalization and India's relationship to globalization. Secondly, a point that I had made at the outset of this class. We discussed it at some length, but now is a time to revisit it because now we've had 10 weeks of lectures and readings. And that is India as a civilization in comparison to India as a nation state. Because we want to get some sense of what the future might be. I'm not in the business of prophesizing. That's not what I do. Nobody can really do prophecy here, and I can't really tell what the future is going to be, but I am interested obviously in what kind of future there is for 1.25 billion people in the world. And in order to understand that, I think we need to make some distinctions, primarily the distinction between a civilization and a nation state. And number three, I'm interested in the anxieties that afflict Indians, right? Particularly educated middle-class Indians. We are all educated here, so obviously I think that to some extent we have some access to that worldview, right? We have some access to that worldview. It's always a difficult question about how one accesses worldviews that are dramatically different from one's own. How does one study a civilization that is dramatically different from one's own without falling into the usual pitfalls? And the usual pitfalls is you use your own experience, you use the experience of your own country, and then you use that as a template to understand everything else. Right? So, for example, communalism, a subject that we've discussed in this class often. And one of the fundamental problems, of course, when one studies communalism is the fact that the Europeans who came to India, they came from a context where, to be quite blunt about it, religious conflict was endemic. I mean, if you have done the history of Europe in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, not to mention going back to the Crusades and the wars with Islam, right? But if you've looked at that history, you know there was brutal religious conflict in virtually all of Europe for a very long period of time. And I think the Europeans assumed that because there had been brutal religious conflict, for example, between Catholics and Protestants, and we're not even going to get into the sectarian histories, you know, to the Anabaptists and Methodists and so forth and so on. But if you just look at the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the religious wars, now the Europeans assumed that because that was their history, this was the history of everybody else. And that, of course, is the origins of communalism. But the real challenge there is, how does one study a civilization that is in some respects dramatically different from one's own? Right? That's, I think, the question that you should always keep in mind, not simply with respect to this class, but with respect to any kind of material that you encounter. When you see statements being made about Afghanistan and the Arab world or Islam, you know, that this is the essential nature of this civilization, well, I think you should stop and question yourself. And you should question the writer most often about what they've written. Right, so those are the considerations that I think are important. Now, before I begin the lecture as such, let me just ask, let me try to engage in a little discussion. So one of the things that I assigned to you was a piece from one of my books. The book is called Of Cricket, Guinness and Gandhi. It's got this little quirky title because I think that sometimes one does things which cannot be accommodated within the usual rubric. And so the piece I assigned you was the opening chapter of that book. And for those of you who have read it, you know what it's about at some level. And that is the fact that Indians have been obsessed with the Guinness Book of Records. Yeah, I started noticing this about 20 years ago. I would pick up an Indian newspaper and there would be a little news item there. You know, Indian gets into the Guinness Book of Records because he's got the longest mustache in the world. Right? Or because he's run the longest distance backwards. You know, you would see these little items there. So I got really intrigued. Why are Indians so obsessed with this Guinness Book of Records? So I actually wrote to the Guinness headquarters. And I entered into a correspondence with them, and they actually shared some statistics with me which are quite extraordinary. And the statistics they shared was that Indians actually only have less than 0.5% of all the records in the Guinness Book of Records, but between 10 to 15% of all the claims made are actually made by Indians. You know, because when a person claims to have set a record, they have to verify it. So let's say if you claim to have the longest mustache in the world and 100 people have made that claim, well, it has to be verified. And they verify it 3 times. So they'll have 3 different people go on 3 different occasions to measure the mustache. Or if you've got the longest fingernails in the world. Right, so forth and so on. I mean, there are thousands of such records, and so there are all these claims, and they have to be verified. And the question is, so what does this amount to? Is this just something that you read and then you say, oh, well, that's amusing? Right? Or is one able to then draw some inferences from this material? Right? And in order to understand why one might be able to draw some inferences, think about it. Let me give you a parallel example, which I mentioned only fleetingly, but it's mentioned in the article. And that is that, you know, India's got a population, as you know, approximately 1.25 billion. Now, when the Olympics takes place, which is every 4 years, I'm not including the Winter Olympics, that's every 4 years too, but I'm talking about the main Olympics, which are held in the summer. Well, a country of 1.25 billion always gets fewer medals than Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, not to mention 100 other countries. And you have no idea, unless you're sitting in India, what kind of anguish the middle class is going through. They're thumping their chest, you know. How come we never win any medal? And there were years, by the way, when India didn't win a single medal, not even a bronze medal. And I remember an occasion, I think it was about 20 years ago, when one Indian won a bronze medal. That was it. And when that person came back to India, I mean, they were received like they were royalty, you know. I mean, the Queen of England would not have gotten the kind of reception that this bronze medal winner got when this person came back to India. Now, the question is, what are we to understand from that? And of course, there's an anxiety. This is what I mean by the anxieties. So one anxiety is that you've got a large country, second most populous country in the world, probably is going to become the most populous country within another 15 years, according to projections that we have in the world. And yet, it's nearly at the bottom of the World Development Index. On the other hand, it has a nuclear program. It's a nuclear state. One of a handful of countries that's a nuclear state. Right? And of course, most people who are somewhat educated would always have run into Indians at universities. You know, right? One of these things that circulates on the internet. You know, the internet, of course, you can circulate anything that you want. But this is circulated with great pride. I get some version of this in my inbox almost every day. That if you look at NASA, right, the space agency here, the claim in these emails is that 20% of all the scientists and engineers employed at NASA are Indians. 20%. 30% of all Silicon Valley startups are run by Indians. Some of those figures, by the way, are not completely off the mark. They're reasonably close figures. It may be 20% instead of 30, it may be 25, and you know, it could vary from year to year, and then you know, whether a person is only an Indian or you know, they happen to be a hybrid, so forth and so on, that's where you can fudge the figures, but it's high. It's high in proportion to the percentage of Indians in the population. Right? Because what's the percentage of Indians in the United States? Slightly less than 1% of the population. And of course, then some people will not understand that, well, yes, I mean, the Indians who are here, they're not representing the cross-section of Indian society. Right? If you've come here to do a graduate degree from India, you're likely coming from a reasonably educated family to begin with, and even if you're on a fellowship, nonetheless, you do not represent the cross-section of Indian society. You represent the elite sector, in some sense. Okay? Maybe the elite here is not the top 1%, but it's the middle class, at least. And in that sense, it's not representative. But we don't need to get into technicalities. What we're trying to understand is that there is this enormous anxiety, what I've called the anxiety of influence. That why is it that we, as a country, are not as a people, why are we as a people not able to impress ourselves upon the rest of the world? Why is it that we don't really have a force? Why don't we count as a people? Why are we not treated with the respect? One of the things that Indians loathe is they loathe any comparison with Pakistan. You know, here's Pakistan, the failed state, right? This is a typical representation of Pakistan. Failed state, theocratic state. And of course the argument is that, well, they don't have the slightest idea about how to run a democracy in Pakistan, and of course they can't claim the number of scientists and physicists even proportionately that we can claim. And then of course we have got Bollywood, etc., etc. You know, you can just keep on piling it up. But this anxiety that India should be compared with Pakistan, this is deeply offensive to all middle class Indians. Deeply offensive. And I'm not interested in saying whether it should or should not be. I'm interested in the phenomenon, right? This anxiety of influence that we're talking about. Now, we'll return to this issue, but let me start by first suggesting that India is not only a nation state, it's also a civilization. Right? And as a civilization, it has an extraordinarily long history. It's one of the two longest continuous civilizations in the world, along with China. But as a nation state, it's a relatively new entity, born in 1947. Now, it must be said immediately that the nation state everywhere in the world is, in the long span of history, a relatively new concept. So it arises in Europe in the 17th century. There's something called the Westphalia Treaty, and the second half of the 17th century is really the birth of the nation state. It must also be said that creating a nation state is an extremely bloody affair. When you live in the nation state, you're living 25, in the case of the United States, 250 years after the process started. And it was an extremely bloody affair, even in the United States. It was an extremely bloody affair because it entailed slavery, genocide of the Native Americans, and that's how the US comes about as a nation state. And this is not singularly the history only of the United States. You'll be very surprised to learn, unless you're a specialist in European history. There was a book written by a former colleague of mine here in the history department, an exceedingly well-known professor of French history, Eugene Weber, and he has a book about the making of France. Peasants turned into Frenchmen. And one of the arguments that he makes in this book, and he, I think, gives an overwhelming case for the argument, is that even a country like France, which we see as relatively homogeneous, and I think certainly relative to India, every place is homogeneous, no question about it. I mean, even China is extremely homogeneous relative to India, I would argue. Not to mention the most obvious case, such as Japan, which is exceedingly homogeneous, although even there you do have some smaller ethnic minorities, but on the whole, it's an exceedingly homogeneous society. Right? Now, in the case of France, one of the things he argues is that as late as the middle part of the 19th century, most of what becomes France is not French-speaking. It's not French-speaking. So how do you turn people into citizens, into subjects? They're first subjects, and then some of them become citizens. Not everybody becomes a citizen. We know that. So African Americans really were subjects, but they were not really citizens. How do you turn them into citizens of a nation state? Right? What is the process that you use? And one of the things that the nation state does is it tries to produce the sense of belonging to that nation state by, for example, stressing ties of history or ties of blood. Right? It could be ties of history, ties of blood, it could be ties of language. Now in India, of course, that's going to be exceedingly difficult. Ties of language will be exceedingly difficult. And one of the ways in which it tries to introduce all these ties is through a process of homogenization. One of the fundamental instruments of that homogenization is the textbook, which is one reason why I never use a textbook. I haven't used a textbook in 20 years of teaching here. Because a textbook condenses a certain form of knowledge and homogenizes it. And then it expects everybody to know it. I mean, look at all the schools, right? I mean, my son and my daughter go to school, and of course they have a textbook for every subject. The textbook homogenizes a certain field of knowledge. And then you have to say the certain field of knowledge that is homogenized according to whose version, according to whose vision of that history. Right? That's why the textbook is an exceedingly dangerous instrument, but used universally. So let's suppose you were doing a history of the textbook. When did the textbook actually arise as an instrument of pedagogy in countries? Right? Interesting question. But I'm just raising the question for you, and now I want to suggest to you that one of the things, and I think you would agree, I don't think there would be any disagreement about that, I suspect, that one of the ways in which, for example, a nation state seeks to get the loyalty of all of its subjects and suggests that everybody has something in common is through something called the national anthem. Every nation state has a national anthem. And the national anthem is going to be in the national language. Right? The national anthem of the United States is not going to be in Ukrainian or Hindi. Right? I think we can be clear about that. And the national anthem of Les Marseillais in France is going to be in French. And so forth and so on. Now, India is an anomaly. It's a complete anomaly in this respect. And I want to explain why it's an anomaly and then try to draw some inferences from that with which you can agree or disagree, as you like. So I've written on this board here the names of 3 people, each of whom composed a song, each of which I want to suggest to you has the status of something called the national anthem. In India, officially, by the way, they make a distinction between the national anthem and the national song. But that distinction really doesn't mean anything at all. Because one of the things you'd have to remember immediately is that if, as I said, you have a national anthem and then you have the national anthem in the national language. Well, what is the national language of India? It doesn't have a national language. Right? I mean, I might say it's Hindi because that would mean 40 to 50% of the population probably speaks Hindi, and then there'll be people who might understand it partially because of, for example, partially because of the wide dispersal of the Hindi film over the course of the last 6-7 decades. Right? But there is no national language. And there are languages such as Bengali, Tamil, Malayalam, all of which have minimum of 50 million speakers. Minimum 50 million speakers. I mentioned to you that if you look at an Indian banknote, the amount on the banknote is written in 14 constitutional languages. So that you have Rabindranath Tagore, who's the most famous man of letters, if I may use that phrase from before, the most famous man of letters in India from the 20th century, India's first winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. He writes a song, it's called Jana Gana Mana. It's partially in Sanskrit, partially in Bengali. 2 languages that are not understood by 95% of the population of India. This is officially the national anthem. Okay? But it's written in languages which, as I said, are completely incomprehensible to majority of the population. Then you have a song by Iqbal, and here now the anomalies become richer and richer. So Sir Muhammad Iqbal wrote a song called Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara. Better than all other nations is this land we call Hindustan, India. Now he wrote this when he was a supporter of Indian nationalism. Later on in life he repudiated this song. Why? Because he became a supporter of the idea of Pakistan. And of course the song is Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara, not Pakistan Hamara, Hindustan. Better than all other lands is India, not Pakistan, because he wrote the song well before the idea of Pakistan was formed. And he is now the national poet of Pakistan. He's the national poet of Pakistan. Okay, Iqbal. But this song, if you saw Diwar, there is this fantastic scene in Diwar when the mother and her 2 boys have migrated to Bombay. And you remember that a few minutes after that, there's a scene where the younger son, Ravi, is standing outside a school, wistfully thinking about the fact that wouldn't it be nice to go to school? And there's a song playing in the background. You know what that song is? Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara. Right? He's listening to it. And then, of course, his older brother realizes that, hey, you know, my younger brother would like to go to school. And it's at that point that Vijay decides that he's going to take up a job and he's going to start polishing shoes. He's going to become a shoe shine boy. Right? That's what he's going to do, in order that he can send his younger brother to school. But it's interesting that the song he's listening to, right, because all the children are gathered in the school, and that's what children do. Very often they recite the national anthem or something like that. But this is not the official national anthem, although it is far more popular than Jana Gana Mana. And then we have a third one called Vande Mataram, which is Hail the Motherland, written by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, a Bengali novelist. And this one is in Bengali or Bangla. Now you can imagine what the Hindu nationalists think, because what would the Hindu nationalists like to do? They'd like to shelve all these three, create a new national anthem, which will be in Hindi. That's what they'd like to do. And this, the fact that we can have these three together, this is what fills me with hope. That's what fills all the Hindu nationalists with despair. This is what fills me with hope. Why? Because what we're saying is that this is a culture that can still accommodate extraordinary notions of plurality. That there's still people who refuse to be homogenized, despite all the provocations that they receive. And I think there's plenty in India to fill one with despair. I get the New York Times daily. I'm one of those few people, I think, as I mentioned to you before, who still gets a print edition in the morning delivered at my doorstep. And in the last 10 days, there have been about 8 articles on India. And if you read those articles, it would be enough to fill anyone with despair. One of those articles is about the condition of the mentally ill in India. You can imagine that even people who are not mentally ill, I think, are suffering enough, and those who are mentally ill, well, they're basically just trash from the point of view, unfortunately, of the state. Who's got time for them in a country worth 1.25 billion? So it basically is an article about the miserable conditions under which these people live. One article is about the fact that India prescribes more antibiotics than half of the world put together. And therefore, now you've got these strains of disease, bacteria, which are completely resistant even to the most recent antibiotics. 900,000 infants killed in India last year because, frankly, the antibiotics were just not effective. Right? So if you keep on reading articles like that, you can see why they would be enough to fill one with despair. However, I'm suggesting to you that the fact that we have this kind of situation is, I think, something that is not only a matter of hope, but something that we need to think about. Because what would the Hindu nationalists like to do? They would like to produce a nation state which is going to be a carbon copy of a successful nation state such as the United States. But then, of course, we have to say, what does successful mean? Successful, how did the US become so successful? How did it become the most powerful country in the world? Why don't we talk a lot more about the long history of slavery? Why don't we talk a lot more about the long history of genocide? Why don't we talk a lot more about the fact that the US has bombed 40 countries in the world? You've got tons of memorials in this country to the Vietnam War, to the 57,000 Americans who died in the war. What about the 3 million Vietnamese who died? 3 million Vietnamese were killed in the Vietnam War. Frankly, it's close to being a genocide. And not a single war memorial in the United States related to Vietnam even mentions the 3 million Vietnamese who were killed. And I want to know, of course, as a side question, how come a puny rice-eating people defeated the largest military machine in the world? I'd really like to know that, and I think we should study that. Because, by the way, when I say rice-eating, this was a big theory in Europe in the 17th century. Read Montesquieu, one of the great European theorists. He divided everybody into 3 groups of people all over the world. You were rice-eating, potato-eating, or wheat-eating. And the rice-eating ones were the weakest and the most despicable, according to this theory. You know? So I want to know how the rice-eating Vietnamese were able to, as I said, hand out a crushing defeat, frankly, to by far the largest military machine in the world. Interesting questions, right? But what's the relevance? The relevance is precisely trying to understand the context, right? That what is it that Hindu nationalists would like to do? They'd like to create a successful nation state. Well, when you say successful, then we have to say, what's their model? What's their model? Their model is the United States. It could be Germany, France, but of course Indians, most educated Indians are, you know, the world that they know outside India is the US. English speaking, the place where they would all like to come to, so forth and so on. Right? That's the model that they want to create. Now, this is, I think, what, let's go back to the Guinness Book of Records. Let's tie in that now. So there's this anxiety in the Indian middle class. The anxiety is that, well, we're a civilization. This is the land that produced the Buddha. This is where Buddhism was born, one of the great major world religions, and the Buddha is unquestionably one of the most majestic figures in world history. And then 2,500 years later, this is a civilization that produced Mahatma Gandhi, the principal architect of the idea of nonviolence in the 20th century. Right? Think about what, and then of course you're saying, in between, we did all these other things. We produced the greatest epic in the world, the Mahabharata, you know, mathematics, astronomy, linguistics were very, very advanced in India. They were. So how did we get reduced to our present state? That's one question. To answer that, then you have to look at the long span of history. Now, not everybody has the patience to do that, or the capacity to do that, or the skills to do that. So you obviously take a number of leaps. But it is important in those leaps to simply say that, well, the world unquestionably knows that India has contributed a great deal to world history. Right? That's what the Hindu nationalists, that's their vision. However, the problem is that having produced the Buddha and having produced the Gandhi, it doesn't earn you much purchase in the modern world. Most people couldn't care less whether you produced a Buddha or not. What matters is, can you feed your people? Do you have something equivalent to the American stock market and Wall Street in India? Something on that scale. How come all the people who do the outsourcing are Indians, but how come all the great ideas are all coming out from here? After all, Steve Jobs or Bill Gates were not Indians. Right? That's what they're thinking. That's the concern for them. So the concern for them is that, yes, we understand that India was a great civilization, but frankly, it's not humbug, but it just doesn't get you anywhere nowadays. Because all that really matters, from their point of view, is the fact that you have to be a powerful nation state. And this is, you know, Henry Kissinger, when he was the Secretary of State in the United States 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, you know, when China went nuclear, so China was the first country in Asia to go nuclear, right, become a nuclear state. Kissinger wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, and he said very clearly, the Chinese are very smart because they understand that nobody really cares a fig about Chinese civilization and Confucius, but if China has a nuclear weapon, we're going to take them a lot more seriously. That's what Kissinger wrote. That the only thing that earns you respect, unfortunately, in the modern world is being a muscular nation state. Now I've added a new word to my discussion, muscular nation state. Right? And of course that's one reason why India decided to go nuclear. Because then you have to logically ask yourself, I mean, why would India expend such a huge amount of money? You know, there's a piece by Amartya Sen which is in the reading for this week. So if you read it, he goes over some of these questions. Why would India expend such a huge amount of money developing its nuclear weaponry program, considering all the problems that India has? And we don't need to rehearse them now because you've heard about that over the course of the last 9 weeks already. So why is India doing that? Because one of the things it's doing is it's looking at China and saying, well, this is what got China some respect. Now we can earn some respect in the world too. Right? That's the thinking there about going nuclear. Now, of course, the arguments that are going to be advanced officially are completely different. The arguments that are going to be advanced officially are nuclear deterrence. We need nuclear deterrence. Who do you need nuclear deterrence against? Obviously Pakistan and China itself. Right? But then, of course, you'd have to examine the whole theory of nuclear deterrence. And that's one reason why, despite the fact that you've had two huge nation states with a massive nuclear arsenal, that is the United States and Russia, or the Soviet Union as it was known before, that's one reason why essentially there's a balance that is maintained, and neither country has obviously launched nuclear weapons, except for, of course, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, right, but after that there's never been an incident, and everybody really knows, in a sense, that it would be absolute suicide to do that. And yet, why does India, why does Pakistan still use the doctrine of nuclear deterrence? Why do they expend so much money? One of the reasons why they do so, I'm saying, and this is where economic data is not going to be sufficient. One of the reasons they do so is because of the notion that being a nuclear state is a form of cultural capital. Right? It's what earns you respect in the world. Nobody's going to be fooling around with us if we're a nuclear state. And so if you go back to the Guinness Book of Records now, I'm saying that's really what's behind all of that. Except that, of course, and this is where it becomes exceedingly complex. So on the one hand, I want to suggest to you that the middle class in India has all these anxieties. And these anxieties are that, well, we're such a large nation, but we can't even get one miserable bronze medal in the Olympics. It's shameful, because Kenya will win 4. You know why Kenya wins 4, right? I hope all of you know that. Because Kenya and Ethiopia, between the two of them, dominate long-distance running. I mean, just, every time they have a marathon, Boston Marathon, New York Marathon, just look at who the winners are. They're always Kenyans and Ethiopians. They just dominate that sector completely. And so they've got, a guaranteed number of medals. Well, India doesn't dominate anything in the Olympics at all. And I found it very amusing that the one gold medal that India won some years ago was for shooting, right? Because in India, you can't actually lawfully own a gun, except in very rare circumstances, right? Yeah.
To say that Indians are shameful of not winning a bronze,
yeah.
maybe they're just not taking that sport, but another subject, who wins, union.
You see, look, you have to look at it this way. And I hope it's very clear to you that it's not shameful for me. I don't care whether India wins a medal or not. I think it's fantastic, actually, that India doesn't win any medal, personally, because who wants to join the rat race? Right? I mean, that's what it is. It's a rat race. How do you judge countries? You judge them, right? So not simply by the percent of people who are literate, but you judge them by, for example, the number of gold medals. And by the way, this was very important even for countries like the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the Olympics was a matter of politics. There's always politics. Never imagine for a second that there isn't politics in sports. Of course, from my point of view, there's politics in everything, including what you eat. Always. So the answer to the question that has been posed here is that, you see, one should never minimize these things that appear to be trivial. This is not trivial, because the trivial is always the index to what is the most profound anxiety that afflicts you as a people. What is the anxiety afflicting them here? The anxiety has to do with the fact that how you do in the Olympics has some relationship in the tacit understanding that we have to something called masculinity. Masculinity. Right? That this is a sign of being a virile nation. A nation that makes itself heard. Why do countries invest so much in their sports programs? This is one of the reasons why they do so. Now, this does not in any way diminish the fact that there may be other areas, for example, where Indians may be doing exceedingly well. So, for example, if you look at the English novel English novel today, I mean, half of the globally most well-known writers in English today are from India. I could give you a list of 50 in 3 minutes. Okay? Half of them are Indians. And now, by the way, several Pakistanis will become quite important as well in the emergence of the novel in English. But the problem, of course, is that the people who read that kind of literature, the people who are aware of that, that's a very small, minuscule portion of the population anyhow. When my relatives pick up the Times of India, when the Olympics are going on, and they go to the sports pages and they look at the medal tally, I can tell you, their eyes go over the medal tally. Where is India? How come India is not even close to Uzbekistan? Uzbekistan, right? And Tajikistan, they're winning more medals than India with 1.25 billion people. That's what you have to think about. What is the anxiety? It's the anxiety of influence. That here, we're a country that produced the Buddha, Gandhi, great literature, the Mahabharata, physics, mathematics, so forth, so on, right? And yet, we can't even get a medal, right? Let me just continue with my train of thought for a second because I need to. So, what I'm suggesting here is that in this, now this is where the narrative is becoming more complex. It's going to become more complex because, and this is what fills me with hope. Now, on the one hand, I'm saying to you that it seems like Indians have surrendered. They have surrendered. Why? Because they're miserable enough that they want to get into the Guinness Book of Records with the most stupid records that you can think about. But that's exactly why it's interesting. Because the records they get into the Guinness Book are all records having to do with being counterproductive. Counterproductive. Who has the longest fingernails in the world? If you see the photograph in the Guinness Book of Records, this man, his fingernails together on the 5 fingers exceed 30 feet. 30 feet. Now, you cannot use that hand for anything. I hope you understand that. You cannot use that hand. Because if you do anything other than turn it into a museum piece, that's what it is. He's now turned his hand into a museum piece. So whatever he does, he has to do with his left hand. Okay? And this is counterproductive. What is the most dominant ethos of modernity? It's productivity. It's the whole idea of the market, growth. Right? That's why the economists are now the theologians of today. They are the high priests, right? Because economics is the king. Though that's the whole idea. Every country is interested in growth and development. I think I've told you before, the economists here are paid twice as much as the art historians in this university. And that's true of every university in the United States. Right? Is what they do much more inherently valuable than what a psychologist or art historian does? Of course not. But that's not how they look at it. Why does a business school have plush, lobbies, and if you go to the history department, well, it doesn't quite look that way. Right? Why is the money all going there? It has to do with the fact that the mantra, the chant of modernity is growth, development, the market. Right? And the market means productivity. That's the whole idea. You increase productivity and continue doing that endlessly. And of course, then we get into such things as climate change problems, consumption, when life starts to become completely skewed and off balance. Right? So, you understand what I'm arguing here in this piece. I'm saying that prima facie, on the one hand, it's clear that India has surrendered. It's said, we're going to join the rat race. We're going to join the rat race. We're interested in becoming like the US. We want to win more medals. We want to have more people in the Guinness Book of Records. Of course, we want to have greater productivity, all of that. On the other hand, there is a resistance in everybody in India. That resistance comes from the fact that the project of the nation state is an incomplete project. It's incomplete everywhere, by the way, but it's woefully incomplete in India. Because what would it mean to be complete? To be complete means that all the country has been homogenized into thinking pretty much the same way. That we all do our shopping at the equivalent of Walmart and Costco. Well, all you can quibble about is whether you want to go to Walmart or Costco, right? I mean, if that's the most enlightened debate that we're going to be reduced to having, which is what happens when the market becomes all dominant. But in the end, I'm saying, at the same person who seems to have surrendered, a part of himself is resisting this impulse. So what does he do? He or she, he sets the record for the most unproductive thing that you can think about. Right? You have a mustache that's, 8 feet. Imagine, 8 feet wide. Okay? Or running backwards. This is when the Prime Minister of India, his big slogan was, let's take the country forward. This guy, he sets a world record for running backwards. I just love it. Right? That's the anomaly. And this, I'm saying to you, this is not trivia, because it gives you an insight into what's happening over there. So I'm saying, in India, we have still a contest between the idea of India as a nation state. If it's going to be only a nation state, it's going to be tragic. And it's going to be tragic because I think the nation state is a tragic entity everywhere in the world. It homogenizes people, railroads them, brutalizes them. That's the story of France. If most of France was not French speaking, what did you have to do? You had to coerce people into taking up French. And usually the coercion is at the point of the sword. Right? What is the story of the Soviet Union in the 20th century? It's a story of trying to catch up to the West. What's the story of China today? Not just catch up, but we'll do better than the West if we can. So the question is, do we in India want to simply go down that trajectory, or is there still some hope and say that, well, look, we need to step back here, we need to think of our civilizational moorings, we need to think about what's not simply best for all of us, but how can one resist the dominant forces of homogenization? And this brings me to the subject of globalization. I've sort of hinted at it when I've talked about the market, but I want to make it much more explicit now. Now, when we say globalization, most people, in my view, mistakenly think of it as a relatively recent phenomenon. And let's say, when did the term really first start to be used widely in literature? I can tell you, about 30 years ago. That's when the term started to be used. And then, of course, it became extremely popularized, and then you got cliches, such as the one by Hillary Clinton, right? The whole world is a village kind of thing. Complete mumbo-jumbo, frankly, if you ask me. What does that mean, right? But globalization, I want to submit to you, is in fact a process that's been going on for several centuries. Several centuries. For example, the slave trade was probably the first form of globalization in the modern period. What is globalization, right? Globalization means the rapid exchange of goods, the rapid movement of people, the transgression of boundaries, right? That's why, of course, all the major capitalist economies love a globalized world, because they just love to see Coca-Cola in every nook and corner of the world where even colonialism was not able to reach it. One way to look at globalization is to say that globalization aims to finish the job that colonialism started but could not finish. Because what did colonialism do? It brought artifacts of Western civilization to the rest of the world. Right? But what was the degree of penetration of colonialism? In some cases, not very much. In some cases, immense. So in India, there were large pockets of people. At the time of independence in 1947, there were huge pockets of people who, frankly, had no contact with anyone who was a white man. I asked my father, who was quite educated, by the way, several degrees. He never saw a white man until he was in his 20s. Right? And he didn't live, at 10,000 feet in some remote little, mountain village. Not at all. But we're not just talking about whether you saw a white man or a white woman. I'm saying that the artifacts of colonialism, including English education, had not penetrated widely, or the legal system had not penetrated widely necessarily into all parts of the country. Now, globalization, one way of looking at it is to say that globalization, as I said, resumes the job, finishes the job that colonialism was not able to do. Because if globalization means that borders no longer count, and which of course is completely false, because all those who are in favor of globalization also believe in enforcing borders. You wouldn't have any problem of so-called illegal immigrants to the United States if we didn't have borders. So this idea that, oh, borders don't exist for people who believe in globalization, that's complete nonsense, frankly. It's just that they want borders in some places and don't want borders in other places. They don't want borders for American goods. They don't want borders for American cars. Those cars and American goods should be able to go anywhere in the world. And I'm not saying that only the Americans think that way. Of course, if you're French, then you want French goods to be able to circulate widely all around the world. But borders matter, because try walking into the United States or flying into the United States without a passport and a visa if you don't happen to be an American citizen. Right? So globalization is, what's a brief definition? Brief definition is that globalization is a social process which involves the rapid exchange of goods, the circulation of goods without hindrance, a greater facility for communication. That would be the other aspect of it, the fact that all of us sitting here can shoot off a message and somebody in India in 10 seconds can access it, right? Through whatever means, whether it's texting or Skype, etc., etc. All of that would be entailed in globalization. However, my suggestion to you is really the following, that yes, that's one definition of globalization, but if you use even that definition, in the 17th century, the slave trade was a form of globalization, because what did it do? For example, it involved 4 continents. 4 continents. Right? It involved the Americas, it involved Europe, it involved Africa, and depending on where you were getting from and which particular kind of slave trade you're talking about, the portions of the Middle East are involved as well, but certainly Africa, North America, South America, and Europe. Huge number of middlemen involved in it, which is what happens in globalization. So you've got a company based here, and then they've got obviously subsidiaries, branches, middlemen, agents, right? All of this was involved in the slave trade. Now, if we're all gung-ho about globalization, are we also gung-ho about the slave trade? I hope not. We'd have to really think about what globalization really means. But I want to make a much more radical claim than that. When we say globalization, what people think about is how certain icons and images and certain kinds of things get globalized. So if I said, what's an illustration of globalization? Somebody might say McDonald's. Right? And that would be correct, by the way. The US military and McDonald's are both in about 180 countries, by the way. That's another thing that's become globalized, is the US military, for your information, if you don't know. Okay? They have bases in as many countries as McDonald's. Okay? And you want to ask yourself why they do. So McDonald's, Burger King, right? Then we can say, how about icons? How about Madonna or Lady Gaga? Right? These are all globalized figures. You know, I was traveling in remote parts of Thailand 20 years ago when the biggest basketball star was, of course, Michael Jordan. And his number, that T-shirt, you could see it in the most obscure parts of Thailand and Indonesia. That number and that figure had become completely globalized. Nike, Adidas, right? Nintendo, all of these things, and 50 other things, they all became globalized. So they cross borders, and of course when they cross borders, then there are interesting things. You know, when McDonald's, of course, that's what they do. They hire all these people who study this, that when McDonald's globalizes, it just doesn't do it, quote, in a uniform way, right? So it has to package things a little bit differently. For example, in India, it cannot sell its largest selling item for the obvious reason that the cow is sacred. So what kind of McDonald's are you going to have where there are no beef burgers? And that's why there's this company that produces dal, which the Indians got very upset by, especially the Gujaratis. So there's a little doll, I have it in my collection, and it's a Gujarati. They're the very racist kind of dolls. So it's got 5 buttons produced by a company here. You press button number 2, and this Gujarati says, give me a burger, everything on it, no beef. Yeah? Everything on it, no beef. Right? So that was your little Gujarati doll, right? So what does McDonald's do? It tailors its products to that particular country, right? So if it's selling its burgers in Muslim countries, what does it have to do? Anybody? What's the one requirement? Immediate, yeah? Halal. Or, yeah, no pork, of course, and all meat has to be halal, right? I'm not going to get into discussing what halal is, but it's you know. It's the equivalent of kosher, if I may put it this way. And of course, by the way, if you're selling in Israel, you have McDonald's that have to observe all the kosher laws, all of them in their McDonald's. And in India, of course, it means no beef, etc., etc., etc. And that's why they hire all these so-called smart MBA types, right? Okay, well, let's just figure out what's the best marketing strategy, you know, for India or for Nepal or whatever the case might be. So now, my submission to you is the following. That, yes, this is not incorrect to say that McDonald's and Madonna and Michael Jordan and LeBron James, they all become globalized figures. However, this is not very interesting. Because this is not where the greatest peril is. What really becomes globalized, and we don't know about it, and that's really what I study, and that's what I've tried to convey to you in little bits and pieces, right? What really gets globalized are certain forms of thinking. Knowledge systems. So Western social science becomes the social science for all over the world. Doesn't matter whether you're in Timbuktu or Beijing or Banaras in India. Doesn't matter. The assumption is the same models that are used to study the West are going to be the models by which we're going to study the rest of the world. And that's one reason why all of these countries are in such dire straits. They're in such dire straits because the templates, all the social science templates, the dominant templates, what is growth, what is poverty, what is development, the examples, the experience, the history of all of this in the West just gets applied automatically to these countries. Right? And then you say that, well, let's see if it works over there. How we think about something called poverty. Right? What is poverty? So remember what I did in my last lecture. I gave you a very good illustration of that. If you remember, what did I end my lecture with? Homeless. The category. See, what knowledge systems do is they produce categories. It is through these categories that we try to understand the world around us. Because, of course, the world is an enormous place. It's extremely confusing. There are millions of different things that are going on. So then you have to say, well, how do we give it some shape and order? That's what the academic disciplines seek to do. Have you ever thought about the fact that they're called disciplines? Because they also discipline the world. They're not just fields of study. Through a discipline called economics, we discipline the world. We make it more manageable. And each of the disciplines has its own special provenance. It may be completely artificial. I mean, in one word, I could give you the special provenance for all the social sciences. For economics, for example, it's growth. Anthropology, it's the other. When you study the other, it's anthropology. When you study your own underclasses, your own working class, it's called sociology. When you study the psyche, it's called psychology. So forth and so on. When you study space, what's a discipline? Geography. When you study time, it's history. Of course, it's much more complex because we can see what is the interchangeability. And that's what I tried to do when I was talking to you about the idea of development. That development is not just a spatial concept. There's this place called the developing world, the third world, the global south, whatever your favorite phrase for it. It's a temporal concept. So concepts that appear to be spatial may be temporal, and concepts that are temporal may actually be spatial as well. But these disciplines, they all try to order the world. Now, when you order the world, what do? You use categories. It is through these categories that you order this inchoate mass of material, and the problem is that when we speak about globalization, what we're really talking about is how the categories that were produced out of the experience of the West become the categories for everyone's history, for everyone's experience. And when that happens, their futures become hijacked. Right? That is the tragedy of the nation state. And it's a tragedy of India as a nation state. But I'm suggesting that this, you have to keep in mind the following proviso, that in India, I think, there is still a tussle going on between the nation state, which is a disempowering idea, and the notion of India as a civilization, which is an idea that has possibilities. It's the idea of India as a civilization that produces something like this, and most Indians say, we're perfectly happy with this. It's only, of course, the Hindu nationalists who want to copy the idea of the nation state from the West, lock, stock, and barrel, completely. They say, no, we can't have this kind of mess going on. It's like a religion. We have 330 million gods and goddesses, right? They say that typically Hinduism is not a monotheistic faith of the kind, it's not an Abrahamic faith. There's no one book, right? There's no one place of pilgrimage. There's no Mecca. There's nothing equivalent to the Quran. And the magical number always used to be given was 330 million gods and goddesses. Nobody's ever done a census of them, by the way. And goddesses and gods in Hinduism, they're born and they die. New goddesses and new gods come up all the time, like Ebola. I bet you anything that there will be a goddess somewhere in India now for the goddess of Ebola. It's not to get Ebola, it's to destroy Ebola. You know, right? I bet you anything that there already is a goddess for Ebola. The gods and goddesses born and they die. Right? This is the nature of that plurality. It's the nature of that madness. And so you have to learn to live with that madness in a way, because that's what gives Indian civilization its richness. You've heard a great deal about the other side of the story as well, because of course we're studying tangible political, socio-economic realities, what happens to the working class, what happens to the Dalits, so forth and so on. But I also want you to think about the other side of the story. All right, I have time for, preferably from someone who has not asked a question, I have time for a couple of questions. You know, either about this lecture or about anything that has preceded. Yes?
Okay. When you were talking about the anxiety of India,
When I was talking about what?
the anxiety of India,
The anxieties. Yeah.
someone going down like the newspaper list and
Yeah.
saying just the medals,
Yeah.
would you consider that an anxiety of the world? Because to me,
Yeah.
and I do this too, I'm like a victim of it too, but if you are judging like a country or even somebody based on my performance in that world,
Yeah.
other than the amount of life sciences and then the people that actually make like a change in this world,
Yeah.
in comparison to like a medal for someone's strength, physics, and intelligence, wouldn't you consider that an anxiety of like not just India but of the modern day world?
But I mentioned very clearly that if you look at the Cold War, that there was always this concern, even in the United States and the Soviet Union. However, we have to remember that some of these phenomena appear in a much more exaggerated form in some places rather than others. So, for example, if you take Iran, the problems there are not dissimilar. Why? Because, again, you have an ancient civilization. You have an ancient civilization, and yet, of course, a nation state that today, quote, officially is a rogue state. And I want to say, by what right does the United States call Iran a rogue state? It wants to have a nuclear program? Well, the US has not just a nuclear program, it's got the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And the only country that has ever thrown nuclear weapons on another country in the world is the United States. It has that singular distinction, if you want to call it that. The idea that people sitting here in the foreign policy establishment should be calling Iran a rogue state is, I think, not just unacceptable, it's downright revolting. You know, right? So, yes, I'm not saying that there might not be other people in other countries that might not have the same kind of thing, but you have to think about the juxtaposition. You see, you cannot have that kind of anxiety, for example, in New Zealand. Why? Because there is no civilization that goes back 2,000 years. The natives were all eliminated, mostly, the Maoris. Right? I'm talking, that's why I said, this is a land that produced the Buddha. Half of the world's religions were born in India. Half of them. Right? The first grammar that was ever written is still considered, ever written anywhere in the world. Panini's grammar of Sanskrit 2,000 years ago is still seriously studied by linguists today. Right? And yet then there are people who are saying to themselves, yeah, but look at India today. Right? Because being a great civilization and all of that, I'm saying, doesn't earn you purchase. So these phenomena, this phenomenon, by the way, is quite unique to India, this one here. So we can also talk about this. You're not going to find a nation state. Incidentally, Rabindranath Tagore, I didn't tell you the other anomalies, he also wrote a song which becomes the national anthem for Bangladesh. Amar Sonar Bangla, my golden Bengal. So that's the national anthem of Bangladesh, a separate country, written by Tagore, who's the national poet of India. Right? But the song is in Bangla, and of course Bangla is not the language, or Bengali as it's otherwise known, is not the language spoken by most Indians. You know. All right, I think that we're going to end with this. Thank you very much.